Welcome back to Boring History for Sleep, where bedtime stories are best told in whispers and sleep becomes unstoppable. You didn't strangle the king this time, you let his psychological disorder do the heavy lifting for you. How kind. If you find comfort in quiet disasters, and this strange little channel helps you fall asleep faster than a royal dynasty collapses, please like, subscribe, and leave a comment. Let us know where in the world you're watching from and what time of night we usually find you. Tonight, you watch the throne rot from within. The king stares at the wall, the queen sharpens her smile, and you quietly decide who should really be in charge. Now settle on down, close your eyes. The fire cracks once. Your breath slows. The sheets are soft, warmer than they should be. Everything is still now, except the weight behind your ribs. That quiet pulsing thing that remembers too much. There's no sound beyond this voice. No motion, except the way sleep gathers behind your eyes. Now, the corridor smells of tallow smoke. Your boots echo. The king hasn't spoken in weeks. The nobles bow to an empty chair. And you are holding the realm like a sick child no one asked you to save. History begins right where someone forgets how to stop it. The year 1453 should have been one of celebration in the English court. Queen Margaret of Anjou, after 8 years of barren marriage, had finally produced an heir. Prince Edward of Westminster arrived in October, pink and screaming and blissfully unaware that his birth would trigger decades of bloodshed. The realm rejoiced with bells and bonfires, though the more observant courtiers noticed the king's peculiar absence from the festivities. Henry VI had always been an unusual monarch. Where other kings hunted and wenched, Henry prayed and fretted. Where others commanded, he suggested. Where others ruled, he drifted through his days like a man perpetually surprised to find himself wearing a crown. But in August 1453, something in the royal mind simply stopped. It began at Clarendon Palace, where the king was reviewing petitions. One moment he was reading, the next he was staring at nothing with the fixed intensity of a saint viewing paradise, or a madman viewing horrors. His counsellors waited. Minutes passed. Then hours. The king didn't move, didn't speak, didn't even blink regularly. Physicians were summoned with their leeches and prayers, nobles whispered in corners, and still Henry stared at something none of them could see. The court tried everything to rouse their catatonic sovereign. They shouted in his ears, waved objects before his eyes, even brought his newborn son to place in his arms. Henry held the child like a man holding a sack of grain, present in body, absent in every way that mattered. The baby cried, the courtiers fretted, and England found itself with a king who'd become furniture. Into this void stepped Richard, Duke of York, with the careful movements of a man approaching a throne that wasn't quite his. York had the bloodline, descended from Edward III through both parents, a genealogy he could recite in his sleep. He had the competence. Military commander, able administrator, the sort of man who actually read financial reports. What he didn't have was the crown, which sat on the head of his vacant cousin like the world's most expensive hat on a scarecrow. Parliament faced an impossible situation. The realm needed governance, but deposing an anointed king was the sort of precedent that ended with everyone's heads on spikes. Their solution was quintessentially English. They created a legal fiction. York would be Lord Protector, ruling in the king's name until his majesty recovered from whatever divine visitation or demonic possession currently occupied him. It was temporary, they assured everyone, especially themselves. York took to power like a duck to water, if ducks were known for aggressive financial reform. He dismissed corrupt officials with the enthusiasm of a man who'd been keeping a list. The Duke of Somerset, who'd been managing England's French territories with all the competence of a blind archer, found himself in the Tower of London before he could say misappropriation. The royal household, bloated with Margaret's French favourites, discovered their positions had mysteriously vanished, along with their expense accounts. Queen Margaret watched these changes with the cold fury of a woman who'd spent 8 years building her power base, only to see it dismantled by her husband's inconvenient madness. The French princess had never been popular. Her marriage had cost England Maine and Anjou, and she had the temerity to be both foreign and female while wielding influence. But unpopular and powerless were different things entirely. She began her counter-offensive with the weapon she knew best: patronage. Northern lords who'd felt neglected by York's southerning reforms found the Queen remarkably generous with promises. The Percy family, nursing ancient grudges against York's Neville allies, discovered Margaret shared their animosities. Lord Clifford, whose estates bordered York's, remembered every slight, real or imagined, and found the Queen an eager audience for his complaints. While York reformed and Margaret schemed, King Henry continued his exploration of Catatonia. Christmas 1453 passed without royal acknowledgement. New Year's 1454 arrived to find the king still frozen, still silent, still eerily present, yet absent. The court developed elaborate rituals around their vegetative monarch, carrying him to meals he didn't eat, dressing him in robes he didn't notice, maintaining the fiction that somewhere behind those vacant eyes a king still resided. Then came the Epiphany Parliament of 1454, where the lords spiritual and temporal gathered to formalise what everyone already knew. Someone had to actually run the country. The debates were fierce but foregone. York had the blood claim, the military reputation, and, most importantly, he was manifestly not drooling into his breakfast. They named him Protector and Defender of the Realm, titles that meant everything and nothing, depending on who held the swords. York's protectorate began with reforms that made sense to everyone except those profiting from corruption. He audited the royal finances and discovered what everyone suspected. The crown was broke, the French territories were hemorrhaging money, and half the royal officials were embezzling, with the dedication of professionals. His response was predictably thorough. Corrupt sheriffs found themselves replaced, crooked customs officials discovered honesty was suddenly mandatory, and the royal household learned the novel concept of living within its means. But power, even temporary power, creates its own opposition. Every dismissed official had family, every reformed abuse had beneficiaries, and every efficient decision made enemies of those who preferred profitable chaos. The Lancastrian lords began to coalesce around Queen Margaret, not from love, but from the mutual recognition that York's competence threatened their comfortable corruptions. By autumn 1454, two distinct factions had emerged. The Yorkists claimed they served the crown and the commonweal, bringing order from chaos. The Lancastrians insisted they protected the rightful king from ambitious usurpers. Both sides armed their retainers, fortified their castles, and practiced their righteousness for the conflict everyone could smell coming. The tension might have continued indefinitely, a cold war of legal manoeuvres and political positioning. But on Christmas Day, 1454, Henry VI blinked, focused his eyes and asked to see his son. The king had returned from wherever his mind had wandered, and with his consciousness came consequences. He expressed surprise at his son's existence, confusion at the passage of time, and absolutely no memory of the previous 16 months. Somerset emerged from the tower faster than dignity strictly allowed, resuming his position with the vindictiveness of a man who'd spent a year composing revenge fantasies. York's dismissal from the protectorate was swift, legal, and accompanied by smiles that promised retribution. The reformed officials found themselves unreformed, the dismissed corruptions reinstated, and the Queen's party triumphant. York withdrew to his estates, but not in defeat. He'd tasted power, and found it suited him. More importantly, he'd built a network of allies who'd profited from competent governance and dreaded its absence. The Earl of Salisbury, his brother-in-law and the North's most powerful magnate, stood with him. Salisbury's son, Richard Neville, Earl of Warwick, young and hungry for glory, added military prowess to political calculation. As 1455 dawned, England had a conscious king who couldn't remember his madness, a queen who couldn't forgive York's presumption, and two armed factions who couldn't pretend their differences were reconcilable. The kingdom stood balanced on a knife's edge, waiting for someone to provide the push. Margaret obliged by summoning a great council to Leicester for May, pointedly excluding York and his allies from the invitation. The implication was clear: attendance would be mandatory, armed retinues forbidden, and the agenda would involve the word treason repeated frequently. York read his non-invitation and made the only decision that made sense. He called his banners and marched south with 3,000 men. The time for legal fictions had passed. England was about to discover what happened when rhetoric met steel, when righteous causes demanded blood payment, and when two royal cousins decided the kingdom wasn't big enough for both of them. The Wars of the Roses hadn't officially begun. Historians would need distance to name the catastrophe. But in castle halls and London taverns, men were already choosing sides, already picking their roses, already sharpening the swords that would turn England into an abattoir. The Mad King had awakened, but his madness had infected the realm, and some illnesses, once contracted, could only be cured by bleeding. The morning of May 22, 1455, found two armies facing each other in the streets of St. Albans with all the enthusiasm of relatives at a forced family reunion. Richard of York had marched south with the speed of a man who knew hesitation meant a short trial and a shorter drop. King Henry had trudged north from London with the resignation of a monarch who'd rather be anywhere else, possibly catatonic again. The royal army arrived first, taking position in the town centre with all the strategic acumen of placing a china shop in a bull run. They barricaded the main streets with carts and timber, posted archers in upper windows, and settled in to wait. The Duke of Somerset commanded the defence, still bitter from his year in the Tower, and determined to make York pay for every moment of imprisonment. With him stood Lord Clifford, whose hatred for York had aged like fine wine into something pure and poisonous. York's forces assembled on the eastern edge of town in Key Field, banners snapping in the morning breeze. Beside him stood the Earl of Salisbury, a man who'd spent 40 years perfecting the art of noble violence, and his son Warwick, young enough to think glory meant something, skilled enough to achieve it. They had 3,000 men to the king's 2,000, but numbers meant less than position in street fighting. The negotiations began at 7 in the morning, conducted by heralds who rode between the armies with messages that grew progressively less diplomatic. York demanded Somerset be surrendered for trial, claiming loyalty to the king but not his evil counsellors. Henry, or rather Somerset speaking through Henry, demanded York dismiss his army and throw himself on royal mercy. The heralds might as well have been carrying recipes for all the good they did. By 10 o'clock, patience had expired on both sides. York gave the signal, and his men advanced on the barricades with the determination of people who knew retreat meant attainder. The first assault foundered in the narrow streets. Royal archers filled the air with arrows, turning the approaches into killing grounds. Yorkist men at arms discovered that attacking uphill through obstacles while being shot at was exactly as pleasant as it sounded. But while the main forces bloodied themselves at the barricades, young Warwick was busy being clever. He led his men through back gardens and side alleys, following routes that suggested someone had been mapping St. Albans with unusual interest. They emerged in the marketplace behind the royal lines, catching the defenders like a fisherman catching fish in a barrel, messy, violent, and thoroughly one-sided. The king's banner fell first, followed quickly by the king's dignity. Henry took an arrow to the neck, not deep enough to kill, but sufficient to remind him why his ancestors had invented armour. He fled to a tanner's cottage, bleeding and bewildered, while his army discovered what happened when defensive positions became death traps. Somerset died making a last stand in Castle Inn, fighting with the fury of a man with nothing left to lose. He took wounds to match his grievances. Contemporary accounts stopped counting at 17. Lord Clifford fell beside him, his hatred for York outlasting him by mere seconds. The Earl of Northumberland added aristocratic weight to the growing pile of noble corpses. The fighting lasted less than an hour, but the dying took longer. Yorkist soldiers pursued fleeing Lancastrians through streets and gardens, turning St. Albans into an open-air anatomy lesson. The lucky ones died quickly. The unlucky discovered that medieval medical care consisted mainly of prayers and hope, neither particularly effective against sword wounds. York found the king in the tanner's house, neck bandaged and dignity absent. The scene that followed was political theatre at its finest. York knelt, proclaimed his loyalty, and swore he'd only acted to save his majesty from evil counsellors. Henry, blood seeping through his bandages, accepted this fiction with the weary grace of a man who'd lost track of which lies to believe. They returned to London in a procession that resembled a funeral march for the kingdom's innocents. York rode high, Henry hunched, the lords who'd survived carefully calculating their chances of continued survival. The capital received them with the enthusiasm of people who knew bills would need paying and blood would need mopping. Parliament convened with indecent haste to legitimise the violence. The Speaker declared York's actions justified, the dead lords posthumously guilty, and the king miraculously rescued from treason. Legal fictions piled upon political necessities until truth became as foreign as French wine. York resumed his position as chief counsellor, Warwick gained fame as the young hero of the hour, and everyone pretended the kingdom hadn't just witnessed nobles murdering each other in the streets. But Queen Margaret hadn't been at St Albans, and she received news of the battle with the calm of a woman planning several funerals. Somerset's death removed her chief ally, but also any possibility of reconciliation. The lords who died were her supporters, their blood on York's hands regardless of parliamentary absolution. She began gathering the threads of opposition with the patience of a spider and considerably more venom. The northern lords responded to her call with alacrity. The Percys of Northumberland, nursing their ancient feud with the Nevilles, found the Queen's cause aligned with their grievances. Lord Clifford's son, also conveniently named Lord Clifford, inherited his father's title and his hatred, both in full measure. The Duke of Exeter, who discovered his royal blood meant less than York's competence, added his spite to the coalition. Margaret worked with the dedication of a woman who'd found her calling. She wrote letters promising rewards, whispered assurances of French gold, and painted York as a usurper whose ambition threatened every noble's inheritance. The fact that York governed competently only made him more dangerous. A weak usurper could be tolerated, an effective one had to be destroyed. Meanwhile, York tried to govern a kingdom increasingly resembling a powder keg in a firesmith's shop. Every decision created enemies, every appointment sparked jealousy, and the king's occasional moments of clarity only added chaos to confusion. Henry would suddenly announce policies that contradicted everything, then lapse back into passive acceptance while his councillors tried to determine which royal pronouncement to follow. The Queen established herself at Coventry, creating a rival court that grew in power as York's position in London weakened. She recruited with promises tailored to each lord's grievances: land for the landless, revenge for the wronged, and power for the ambitious. Her French connections provided gold when promises weren't enough, and her son provided legitimacy that York couldn't match. By 1456, England had two governments pretending to be one. York controlled London and the southeast, ruling through a king who agreed with whoever spoke to him last. Margaret controlled the Midlands and North, ruling through lords who hated York more than they loved peace. Both sides issued proclamations in the king's name, leading to the bizarre situation where royal commands contradicted themselves depending on the messenger. The situation deteriorated through 1457 and 1458, with both sides arming their retainers and fortifying their castles. Noble feuds that had simmered for generations erupted into open violence, using the York-Lancaster split as justification for settling old scores. The Percy-Neville feud in the north turned particularly vicious, with raids and counter-raids that depopulated entire villages. York's attempts at reconciliation failed spectacularly. A great council at Coventry in 1456 ended with Yorkshire nearly arrested. The Parliament in 1457 descended into such acrimony that armed retainers filled the streets. The Love Day of March 1458, where enemies were supposed to walk hand in hand to St Paul's Cathedral, fooled nobody. The participants smiled for the crowd while gripping their sword hilts, and separated immediately afterward to sharpen those same swords. By early 1459, the pretense had worn thinner than a beggar's cloak. Margaret had built her power base into something formidable, a coalition united by hatred of York and lubricated by promises of his lands. York's support, based on good governance and aristocratic alliance, proved more fragile than steel when tested. The Queen made her move in June 1459, summoning a parliament to Coventry. The location was significant, deep in her territory, far from York's London support. The invitations were equally significant, excluding York and his principal allies. The message was clear. Attendance would be mandatory, weapons forbidden, and the agenda would involve trials for treason. York read his non-invitation and understood perfectly. This was no parliament, but a scaffold, with parliamentary decorations. He sent messages to his allies, Salisbury in the north, Warwick in Calais. The time for legal manoeuvring had passed. The Queen wanted blood, and York had no intention of providing his own. As the Yorkist lords gathered their forces, England held its breath. At Albans had been a skirmish, a bloody disagreement between nobles. What was coming would be war, real war, with armies and battles and enough corpses to satisfy even the hungriest crows. The roses had shown their thorns, and now they would draw blood in earnest. The kingdom that had survived French wars and Scottish raids was about to discover that the deadliest enemy was always the one within. Civil war, that peculiarly intimate form of national suicide, was about to begin in earnest. And somewhere in Westminster, King Henry VI sat on his throne, staring at something only he could see, while his kingdom prepared to tear itself apart in his name. The Parliament that convened in Coventry on June 20, 1459, was many things, but parliamentary wasn't one of them. Queen Margaret had orchestrated the gathering with the meticulous care of a woman arranging her enemies' funerals. The city itself breathed Lancastrian loyalty, its walls decorated with red roses, and its gallows freshly reinforced for the anticipated verdicts. The lords who answered the summons came armed with legal precedents and righteous indignation. Those who didn't answer, York, Salisbury, Warwick and their allies, were represented by empty seats that spoke louder than any defence. The Queen presided, with Prince Edward at her side, the 6-year-old heir watching proceedings with the grave attention of a child who knew his inheritance depended on other men's deaths. The charges against the absent lords were read with theatrical solemnity. Treason featured prominently, supported by creative interpretations of every action York had taken since birth. They'd conspired against the king by trying to govern while he was catatonic, shed noble blood, at St. Albans, in self-defence, and corrupted the realm by reforming its finances. The fact that these charges contradicted previous parliamentary pardons troubled nobody with the power to object. The Earl of Wiltshire, serving as Speaker, guided the proceedings with the delicacy of a butcher with a cleaver. Witnesses testified to York's ambitions, their memories improved by promises of confiscated estates. Letters were produced proving correspondence between the accused, which was sinister when viewed through the lens of presumed guilt. The defence consisted of empty chairs and the occasional crow cawing outside, neither particularly eloquent. The verdicts surprised nobody who'd been paying attention. Attainder, that beautiful legal instrument that stripped a man of everything, including his children's inheritance, was pronounced with satisfied finality. York, Salisbury, Warwick and their supporters were declared traitors, their lands forfeit, their titles void, their blood corrupted. Any man could kill them on sight and claim reward rather than punishment. But Margaret had learned from St. Albans. Military force would follow legal condemnation. She dispatched summons across the realm, calling loyal lords to bring their retinues for the king's protection. The responses revealed England's fractures. Northern lords answered eagerly, southern nobles discovered urgent business elsewhere, and the Welsh pretended they couldn't read English. York, at Ludlow Castle on the Welsh border, received news of his attainder with the calm of a man who'd been expecting it. He sent urgent messages to his allies: come armed, come quickly, come prepared for war. The legal fiction of loyalty to the king, while opposing his counsellors, had evaporated. This was now naked conflict between two visions of England, both claiming divine approval. Salisbury marched south from Middleham with the urgency of a man whose neck depended on speed. His route would take him through hostile territory, past lords who'd gladly collect the reward for a traitor's head. Lord Audley, commanding a royal force, moved to intercept him at Blore Heath in Staffordshire. The battle on September 23 proved that enthusiasm was no substitute for experience. Audley had superior numbers and righteous cause. Salisbury had veteran soldiers and the motivation of men fighting with nooses around their necks. The royal forces charged uphill across a brook, discovering that mud, water and arrows created a combination fatal to cavalry pretensions. Audley died in the rout that followed, along with 2,000 of his men. Salisbury lost 500 but gained something invaluable, proof that Lancastrian numbers could be beaten by Yorkist discipline. He continued south, leaving Audley's forces to explain to the Queen how they'd managed to lose despite every advantage. The victory at Blore Heath concentrated minds wonderfully. Margaret's coalition realised the attainted lords wouldn't simply accept their fate peacefully. York's allies understood that partial measures meant partial deaths. They had to win completely or die certainly. Both sides gathered forces with the desperation of gamblers doubling down on losing hands. The armies met at Ludford Bridge just outside Ludlow on October 12. York had assembled his coalition, his own retainers, Salisbury's northern veterans, and troops from Calais under Warwick's command. Facing them stood the royal army, vast and legitimised by the king's presence. Henry VI, propped up in armour he wore like a costume, provided royal authority to the proceedings. The night before battle brought disaster to Yorkist hopes. Andrew Trollope, leading the Calais garrison, discovered scruples about fighting against the royal banner. He and his men defected in the darkness, taking with them detailed knowledge of York's positions and plans. The remaining Yorkist leaders held a desperate council while their cause hemorrhaged troops. By dawn, the situation was hopeless. The royal army outnumbered them 3-1, their positions were compromised, and the king's presence gave their enemies legitimacy they couldn't match. Fighting meant certain defeat and probable death. Flight meant abandoning everything but their lives. York chose flight, but with calculation. He rode for Ireland, where distance and local sympathy might preserve him. His eldest son, Edward Earl of March, accompanied him to learn how princes become exiles. Salisbury, Warwick and York's second son Edmund fled toward Calais, hoping the garrison there remained more loyal than Trollope had proved. They left behind wives, children, and a cause that seemed thoroughly lost. The Duchess of York and her younger children faced the victorious royal army with the dignity of aristocrats who knew their value as hostages. Ludlow itself suffered occupation and pillage, punishment for supporting the wrong roses. Margaret's triumph seemed complete. Her enemies were scattered, attainted, and fleeing. Their properties fell into royal hands, providing resources for rewarding loyalty. The Parliament's verdicts had been enforced by military victory. England was united under Lancastrian rule, with no significant opposition remaining. Except triumph in civil wars was rarely permanent. York ruled Ireland like a king in exile, discovering the Irish preferred his governance to London's neglect. The Irish Parliament declared the English attainders invalid, providing legal cover for military preparation. Dublin became a Yorkist stronghold, close enough to threaten, far enough to defend. Warwick found Calais equally welcoming. The garrison there cared more for regular pay than constitutional niceties. The town's merchants appreciated his enthusiasm for piracy disguised as commerce raiding. Within months, he transformed the port into a Yorkish naval base, funding rebellion through systematic theft from every ship flying the wrong colours. The government in London discovered that declaring men traitors and catching them were different propositions. Attempts to dislodge York from Ireland failed, against Irish intransigence and logistics. The effort to reclaim Calais foundered when Warwick's ships intercepted the expedition, capturing the new intended captain and adding his ransom to their war chest. Through the winter of 1459-60, the Yorkist position improved from desperate to merely dangerous. Warwick's piracy provided funds and damaged royal prestige. York's Irish administration demonstrated competence that contrasted with Lancastrian corruption. Secret messages crossed the Channel and the Irish Sea, coordinating plans for return. The attainted lords also found unexpected support in England itself. The Parliament of Devils had overreached, condemning men whose only proven crime was opposing the Queen's faction. London merchants, tired of economic chaos and French influence, began to whisper that York's financial reforms hadn't been entirely terrible. Southern nobles, watching northern lords claim confiscated estates, wondered when their own lands might prove too tempting. By spring 1460, Margaret's complete victory was revealing its incompleteness. She controlled England, but couldn't reach her enemies. She'd won the legal battle, but discovered law meant nothing to men already condemned. She'd scattered her opposition, but given them nowhere to go except back into rebellion. The Yorkist lords in exile had learned valuable lessons. Legal niceties were worthless against force. Parliamentary authority meant nothing without military victory. The king's banner provided legitimacy, but the king himself was whoever could capture him. Most importantly, they'd learned that half measures in civil war were invitations to execution. When they returned, and everyone knew they would return, it would be with different intentions. No more protestations of loyalty while opposing evil counsellors. No more careful distinctions between king and kingdom. The next phase would be simpler: victory or death, crown or coffin, with no middle ground remaining. Parliament of Devils had clarified the stakes wonderfully. Now it remained to be seen who would pay the price for such clarity. In Coventry, Queen Margaret celebrated her triumph with feasts and rewards. In Dublin and Calais, attainted traitors planned their resurrection. And in between, England waited to see which roses would bloom come spring, and which would be cut down at the root. The Yorkist invasion fleet appeared off Sandwich on June 26, 1460, with the brazen confidence of men who'd decided subtlety was overrated. Warwick, Salisbury and Edward of March landed with 2,000 men, and proclamations of loyalty so transparently false they might as well have been written in invisible ink. They marched toward London through Kent, gathering supporters like a snowball gathering snow, if snowballs were armed and seeking vengeance. The transformation was remarkable. Towns that should have barred their gates instead threw them open with enthusiasm. The men of Kent, who'd risen with Jack Cade 10 years earlier against misgovernment, recognised kindred spirits in these well-dressed rebels. By the time the Yorkist column reached Blackheath, it resembled less an invasion force and more a particularly militant parade. London's response revealed the capital's true feelings about Lancastrian rule. The city gates opened as if magnetised by Yorkist approach. The mayor and aldermen, who'd spent months professing loyalty to Henry VI, discovered urgent reasons to support his opponents. The fact that Warwick had been ensuring smooth trade from Calais while royal ships disrupted commerce might have influenced their decision. The Yorkist lords entered London on July 2 to find a city that had apparently been expecting them. Merchants offered credit, citizens cheered in the streets, and even the clergy discovered biblical justifications for rebellion. The Tower of London, that symbol of royal authority, surrendered after a siege lasting exactly as long as it took to negotiate terms. Lord Scales and other Lancastrian defenders found themselves prisoners in their own fortress. But London was merely the anteroom to power. The real prize was the king himself, currently with the royal army in Coventry. The Yorkists needed Henry VI not as a ruler, but as a rubber stamp, a royal seal to legitimise their actions. They marched north with their growing army, proclaiming their desire to free the king from evil counsellors who'd multiplied remarkably since St Albans. The armies met at Northampton on July 10, in a field that heavy rain had transformed into something resembling primordial soup. The Lancastrians had prepared elaborate fortifications, complete with artillery that looked impressive and proved useless when waterlogged. They had superior numbers, defensive positions, and the king's presence to sanctify their cause. What they also had was Lord Grey of Ruthin, commanding their right wing with the loyalty of a weather vane in a hurricane. As Warwick's division approached his section, Grey made a decision that would echo through history. He ordered his men to help the Yorkists across the defensive ditch, transforming the fortifications from protection to prison. The battle became a slaughter pen. The Duke of Buckingham died trying to rally troops who'd already decided survival trumped loyalty. The Earl of Shrewsbury fell beside him, adding his blood to mud already supersaturated with noble gore. Lord Egremont and Lord Beaumont contributed their lives to the growing pile of Lancastrian corpses. The defensive position became a death trap, as fleeing soldiers discovered that mud and panic made poor companions. King Henry was found in his tent, displaying the same detached calm he had shown throughout his reign. He greeted his captors with weary recognition, as if being captured by different factions was simply another royal duty. Warwick knelt before him, proclaimed his loyalty with a straight face, and the king accepted this fiction with practised grace. The march back to London resembled a coronation procession in reverse. The Yorkists had the king, the capital, and momentum. What they didn't have was Richard of York himself, still in Ireland, waiting to see if his allies' success was permanent or merely another false dawn. Messages flew across the Irish Sea with news of victory and summons to return. York took his time responding, displaying either admirable caution or irritating indecision. He finally landed in Chester on September 9, beginning a journey to London that would reveal his true intentions. His progress through England abandoned all pretense of humble loyalty. He travelled with a retinue suitable for royalty, his banners displaying the royal arms of England undifferenced, a heraldic declaration that he claimed the throne by right, not sufferance. Towns received him with the ceremony due a king, and he did nothing to discourage their assumptions. York entered London on October 10 and proceeded directly to Westminster Hall, where Parliament was sitting. What followed was political theatre that became legendary for its awkwardness. He walked straight to the throne and placed his hand upon it, a gesture pregnant with meaning and ambition. The assembled lords fell silent, waiting for someone else to speak first. The silence stretched until it became physically painful. Finally, Thomas Bourchier, Archbishop of Canterbury, asked if York wished to see the king. York's response: "I know of no one in the realm who would not more fitly come to me," dropped into the silence like a boulder into a still pond. The assembled lords discovered urgent needs to examine their shoes, the ceiling, anywhere but York's expectant face. Even his own supporters shuffled nervously. Claiming the throne while the anointed king still lived crossed lines that made St. Albans look like a minor disagreement. What followed were days of frantic negotiation, legal argumentation, and political manoeuvring. York presented his claim through descent from Lionel of Antwerp, Edward III's second surviving son, versus Henry's descent from John of Gaunt, the third son. The lawyers twisted themselves into knots trying to balance hereditary right against established possession. The compromise they reached satisfied nobody, which in English politics meant it was probably correct. The Act of Accord acknowledged Henry as king for his lifetime, but named York as his heir, disinheriting Prince Edward. It was elegant, legal, and absolutely guaranteed to cause more bloodshed. Queen Margaret, still at large with Prince Edward, received news of the accord with the contained fury of a volcano preparing to erupt. Her son, the child she had waited 8 years to bear, had been legally bastardized by parliamentary sleight of hand. Her response was predictable: raise an army and demonstrate that motherhood trumped parliamentary procedure. She found eager allies among the northern lords who'd benefited from Lancastrian largesse. The Earl of Northumberland, Lord Clifford, son of the one killed at St. Albans, and the Duke of Somerset, son of that corpse from the same battle, rallied to her banner. These men had personal scores to settle with York, blood debts that no parliament could legislate away. By December, Margaret had assembled a formidable force at Hull. York, perhaps overconfident from recent success, decided to march north with a small force to confront her. He spent Christmas at his castle of Sandal, near Wakefield, apparently believing the holy season would pause hostilities. The Lancastrian forces outside had different ideas about Christmas cheer. On December 30, York led his men out of Sandal Castle to face an enemy that outnumbered him 3-1. Whether he was tricked by false negotiations, goaded by taunts, or simply tired of defensive warfare remains unclear. What is clear is that the Battle of Wakefield was less military engagement and more organised murder. York died fighting, which was more dignity than his 17-year-old son Edmund received. The boy was cut down trying to escape, allegedly after being promised quarter. The Earl of Salisbury was captured and beheaded the next day in Pontefract, because apparently the Lancastrians had decided mercy was as outdated as chivalry. But it was York's fate after death that demonstrated the war's new viciousness. His head was struck off and sent to York City, where it was displayed on Micklegate Bar, wearing a paper crown. The message was unsubtle. This was what happened to those who reached for real crowns. Margaret's revenge was complete, brutal, and ultimately self-defeating. The deaths at Wakefield eliminated the Yorkist leadership, but not the Yorkist cause. York had sons who had inherited his ambition along with his grievances. Edward, Earl of March, learned of his father's death while raising forces in the Welsh marches. At 18 years old, 6 feet 4 inches tall, and blessed with the charisma his father had lacked, he responded to tragedy by becoming more dangerous than his father had ever been. The paper crown on York's severed head was meant as mockery. Instead, it became motivation. The son would claim what the father had only dared touch, and he would do it over the bodies of anyone who stood in his way. The wars had entered a new phase, where quarter was neither asked nor given, where parliamentary niceties meant nothing compared to sharp steel, and where the only crown that mattered was the one you could seize and keep. Winter 1460 ended with York's head freezing on its spike, but spring would bring his son's revenge. The white rose had been pruned back to the root, But sometimes pruning only made things grow back stronger. Edward of March received word of his father's death while recruiting in Gloucester, and his response was magnificently practical. He immediately had coins struck declaring himself king. At 18, he possessed what his father had lacked, the ability to inspire men through sheer physical presence and an understanding that in civil wars, audacity succeeded where caution died. The Welsh marches, his hereditary power base, provided troops who cared more for their charismatic lord than constitutional niceties. His first test came quickly. A Lancastrian force under the Earl of Pembroke marched from Wales to prevent him joining Warwick. They met at Mortimer's Cross on February 2, 1461, Candlemas morning, when nature decided to provide omens. 3 suns appeared in the sky, a parhelion caused by ice crystals in the atmosphere, though Edward's army preferred divine intervention as an explanation. Edward seized the moment with instinctive genius. The 3 suns, he declared, represented the Trinity blessing their cause. Or perhaps they symbolized the 3 surviving York sons united in vengeance. The theological details mattered less than the effect. His men fought like they had heaven's personal approval. The battle unfolded with brutal efficiency. Pembroke's Welsh troops, fierce but undisciplined, met Yorkshire soldiers who'd learned their trade in the French wars. Edward commanded from the front, visible in his armour, turning battle into personal performance. When the Lancastrian line broke, he unleashed pursuit with an enthusiasm that suggested revenge ran in the family. Owen Tudor, grandfather to the Lancastrian Prince Edward, was among the captured. The old man went to the block at Hereford still believing his connection to royalty meant something. His last words, seeing the executioner's block, were, "That head shall lie on the stock that was wont to lie on Queen Catherine's lap." The head was then placed on Hereford Market Cross, where a madwoman combed its hair and washed away the blood with tears, a scene too Gothic for fiction, but apparently perfect for the Wars of the Roses. While Edward painted Herefordshire red, Warwick was discovering that military genius had limits. He'd attempted to block Queen Margaret's march south at St Albans, fighting where he'd won before, which proved that history repeated itself mainly as farce. Margaret's army, swollen with northern troops and Scottish borderers, hit him from unexpected directions on February 17. The Second Battle of St Albans demonstrated that Warwick's elaborate defensive preparations, including spiked nets, caltrops and primitive flamethrowers, worked perfectly against the enemy he expected rather than the one he faced. Margaret's forces simply went around his careful fortifications, turning technological innovation into expensive irrelevance. Warwick's army disintegrated with embarrassing speed. Men who'd fought bravely at Northampton discovered urgent business elsewhere. The Kentish levies, deciding that fighting northern savages exceeded their pay grade, departed en masse. Warwick himself fled with the remnants, his reputation for invincibility dying in the Hertfordshire mud. Worse still, he lost custody of King Henry VI, who'd spent the battle tied to a tree for safety, a detail that captures the peculiar mixture of practicality and farce that characterized the wars. The king was reunited with his wife and son in a scene that should have been touching, but was mainly awkward, given that young Prince Edward reportedly asked permission to execute Yorkist prisoners. Margaret now had her husband, her army, and the road to London open. She made the decision that would haunt Lancastrian hopes. She paused. A northern army had pillaged its way south with enthusiasm that terrified everyone in their path. London's gates remained closed, the citizens preferring the devil they knew to the Scottish raiders in Margaret's ranks. This gave Edward of March time to join forces with Warwick's remnants. They met in the Cotswolds, where Edward's natural leadership smoothed over Warwick's humiliation. Together they had an army, a cause, and most importantly, the audacity to claim victory from defeat. They marched on London, which opened its gates with relief. On March 4, 1461, Edward was proclaimed King Edward IV in a ceremony that prioritized speed over splendour. The Bishop of Exeter presided, asking the assembled crowd if they would have Edward as king. The crowd, carefully selected for enthusiasm, roared approval. Legal niceties were abandoned. Henry VI was declared to have forfeited the throne by allowing the deaths at Wakefield, a justification so tortured it practically confessed under questioning. But proclamations were just words without military victory. The real Lancastrian army waited in the north, massive and confident. Both sides knew one climactic battle would settle everything. They met at Towton on March 29, Palm Sunday, in a snowstorm that seemed personally offended by the concept of spring. The armies were enormous. Contemporary claims of 100,000 men were exaggerated, but not by much. Perhaps 50,000 soldiers crowded onto a plateau between the villages of Towton and Saxton, making it the largest battle ever fought on English soil. The Lancastrians held the high ground and superior numbers. Edward had desperation and the wind. That wind proved crucial. It drove snow into Lancastrian faces and carried Yorkist arrows further. The opening archery duel became a one-sided affair, with Lancastrian arrows falling short, while Yorkist shafts found their marks. When arrows ran out, the armies closed for hand-to-hand combat that would last 10 hours. The fighting defied military logic. Men stood toe-to-toe in driving snow, hacking at each other long after exhaustion should have ended things. The battle lines swayed back and forth, marked more by piles of corpses than tactical movement. Edward, towering over the combat, led charge after charge, his white armour making him visible through the snow. The deadlock broke when the Duke of Norfolk's division arrived, fresh troops against exhausted ones. The Lancastrian left crumbled, then ran. Flight became massacre as the Yorkists pursued without mercy. Thousands drowned trying to cross the Cock Beck, so many that chronicles claimed men crossed on bridges of bodies. The snow turned red, then pink, then gave up any pretense of being anything but bloody slush. Edward had forbidden quarter before the battle, and his men obeyed with enthusiasm. Lancastrian nobles were cut down regardless of surrender attempts. The pursuit continued through the night and into the next day. Local tradition claimed the Cock Beck ran red for days afterward, though this might have been poetic license competing with hideous reality. The death toll was staggering. Contemporary sources claimed 28,000 dead, and while medieval chronicles loved their round numbers, even half that would make it England's bloodiest day. Entire noble families ended in the snow, their male lines extinguished in a few hours of slaughter. The Earl of Northumberland died with his traditional enemies, the Nevilles, probably taking satisfaction in their mutual destruction. King Henry VI, Queen Margaret and Prince Edward fled to Scotland, their cause buried under Yorkshire corpses. The northern nobility that had formed Lancastrian power was essentially destroyed. Those who survived faced Edward's justice, which proved as merciful as his father's death suggested it would be. Edward IV entered York through Micklegate Bar, where his father's head still decorated the gateway. He ordered it taken down and properly buried, replacing it with Lancastrian heads in a gesture that summarised the war's elegant brutality. The paper crown had come full circle, mockery transformed into prophecy. The new king progressed south to London for a proper coronation, through a kingdom exhausted by slaughter. He was young, handsome, victorious and mirthless, exactly what England thought it wanted after years of Henry VI's passive sanctity. The white rose bloomed red with Lancastrian blood, its roots fed by corpses at Towton. But victories in civil wars were rarely permanent. Somewhere in Scotland, Margaret of Anjou plotted with the single-minded determination of a woman with nothing left to lose. Her son still lived, her cause still breathed, and Scottish hospitality could be purchased with promises of Berwick. The crown sat heavy on Edward's young head, heavier than his father had ever imagined. Power seized in blood required blood to maintain, and there were still plenty of Lancastrians left to bleed. London welcomed Edward IV in June 1461 with pageantry designed to make everyone forget the circumstances of his accession. Wine flowed from the conduits, mystery plays enacted, his divine right to rule, and beautiful women threw roses from windows, white ones, naturally. The new king, young and golden and magnificently tall, played his part perfectly. He smiled, waved, and managed to look like God's own choice for England's throne rather than someone who'd carved his way there through frozen corpses. His coronation on June 28 was a masterpiece of political theatre. Westminster Abbey glittered with enough gold to fund a small war, which was ironic given how many wars had been fought to put Edward there. The Archbishop of Canterbury, who'd crowned Henry VI twice, once as baby, once as adult, performed the ceremony with practiced efficiency and carefully blank expression. If he noted the irony of crowning a third king in 6 years, he kept it to himself. Edward's court became everything Henry's hadn't been. Where the old king had preferred prayers and contemplation, Edward favoured feasts that lasted until dawn, an entertainment that would have scandalised his predecessor. Musicians, poets, and anyone capable of amusing the king found eager welcome. The court ladies discovered that their new monarch appreciated beauty with an enthusiasm that kept confessors busy. But ruling required more than charisma and broad shoulders. The kingdom Edward inherited resembled a patient who'd survived surgery but might still die from blood loss. Entire regions lay devastated from armies living off the land. Noble families that had maintained order for generations were extinct, their estates masterless and their tenants uncertain. The treasury was empty, drained by years of civil war and Margaret's desperate promises. Edward's solution was characteristically direct. Parliament attainted every Lancastrian they could name, transferring their estates to the crown. The definition of treason stretched to include anyone who'd looked sideways at a white rose. Men were declared traitors retroactively, their crimes consisting of loyalty to the previous king before Edward had claimed the throne. The confiscated lands funded the new regime, creating a patronage network that would have impressed Rome. Warwick received estates that made him the richest man in England after the king. Other Yorkist supporters found themselves elevated from minor gentry to major landowners overnight. Every gift created loyalty, but also expectation of future gifts, a cycle as addictive as it was expensive. In the north, resistance continued with the stubbornness of people with nowhere else to go. Lancastrian holdouts occupied castles that dominated Northumberland. Bamborough, Dunstanburgh, and Alnwick became islands of red roses in an increasingly white sea. They held out through 1461 and 1462, supplied from Scotland and sustained by hope that Margaret would return. She did return, repeatedly, with forces that grew smaller each time. The Queen, who'd once commanded armies, now led raids, slipping across the border with Scottish troops and French gold. Each incursion ended the same way: initial success, growing resistance, hasty retreat. The northern English, exhausted by war, showed decreasing enthusiasm for restoration. Edward delegated the northern problem to Warwick and his brother Montague, who approached siege warfare with workmanlike efficiency. They reduced castles one by one, offering pardons to defenders who surrendered and shortened futures to those who didn't. By 1464, the last Lancastrian strongholds had fallen, their walls breached by cannon and treachery in equal measure. The deposed King Henry VI wandered through this period like a ghost, refusing to be laid. He drifted between Scotland and northern England, sheltered by loyalists who risked everything for a king who barely noticed their sacrifices. Contemporary accounts describe him as cheerful but vacant, blessing his protectors while seeming unsure why they needed blessing. His final capture came in July 1465, betrayed by a monk at Waddington Hall in Lancashire. The arresting party found him at dinner, and he went with them peacefully, apparently relieved to end the charade of resistance. They brought him to London, where Edward displayed his prize with calculated humiliation. Henry entered the capital, with his feet tied beneath his horse, wearing a straw hat that emphasised his fall from majesty. The Tower of London became his residence, comfortable by medieval prison standards but still a cage. Edward, showing either mercy or cunning, kept his predecessor alive. A dead martyr was more dangerous than a living reminder of royal mortality. Henry spent his days in prayer and contemplation, activities indistinguishable from his behaviour as reigning king. Meanwhile, Edward settled into kingship with the enthusiasm of someone discovering a talent they didn't know they had. He proved surprisingly good at the mundane aspects of governance, reading accounts, managing parliament, balancing competing noble interests. His charm worked on London merchants as well as it did on their wives, securing loans through personality, where Henry had failed through piety. But Edward's appetites, so useful in war, proved problematic in peace. His enthusiasm for female company became legendary, earning disapproval from clergy who he cheerfully ignored. More concerning to his nobles was his tendency to make decisions without consultation, trusting his judgment over council consensus. The kingdom slowly healed under his rule, like a patient recovering from severe wounds. Trade resumed, harvests improved, and people began to believe the wars might actually be over. The white rose seemed firmly planted, its roots deep enough to weather any storm. Yet storms gathered on multiple horizons. In France, the new king, Louis XI, known as the Universal Spider for his web of plots, viewed England's weakness as opportunity. He sheltered Lancastrian exiles, funded their schemes, and waited for chances to profit from English division. In Scotland, the relationship between hosting Lancastrians and negotiating with Yorkists created diplomatic tangles that would take years to unravel. Margaret of Anjou, her beauty faded but determination intact, haunted European courts seeking support for her son's cause. Prince Edward, now a teenager, grew up in exile, learning that birthright meant nothing without swords to enforce it. Domestically, the very success of Edward's rule created new problems. Warwick, instrumental in Edward's victory, expected to be instrumental in his governance. He negotiated foreign marriages for the king, planned French alliances, and generally acted like he'd created Edward and could control him. The king smiled, nodded, and did whatever he pleased, creating friction that would eventually combust. The nobles who'd supported York discovered that his son had inherited the family tendency towards centralization. Local privileges that had survived centuries faced royal officials who actually expected law enforcement. Tax collectors appeared in regions that had forgotten such creatures existed. The kingdom was becoming more governed, which those accustomed to governing themselves found alarming. By 1464, Edward IV ruled England with apparent security. His enemies were dead, exiled, or imprisoned. His supporters were rewarded, his treasury recovering, his kingdom at peace. He was young, healthy, and producing bastards with enthusiasm that suggested legitimate heirs would follow. But civil wars never truly ended. They merely paused between acts. The bodies at Towton had been buried, but the grievances that put them there remained. Sons remembered dead fathers, widows nursed hatred alongside orphans, and exiles plotted return with the patience of those with nothing but time. Edward sat secure on his throne, tall and golden in torchlight, the crown heavy but steady on his head. He'd won everything through blood and audacity, proving that in England might could make right if applied with sufficient brutality. The Wars of the Roses appeared over, the white rose triumphant, the red crushed beyond recovery. But Margaret still lived, her son still breathed, and French gold still glittered with possibility. The Lancastrian cause, like Henry himself, refused to die properly. It lingered at the edges of Edward's bright kingdom, waiting for the mistakes that new kings inevitably made. The throne was his, bought with blood at Towton and a dozen other fields. But keeping it would require different skills than winning it, and Edward was about to discover that former allies could become the deadliest enemies. In France, in Scotland, in the bitter hearts of dispossessed nobles, plots fermented like wine, growing stronger with age. The young king had won his crown through war. Now he would have to prove he could keep it through peace, a challenge that had destroyed better men than him. The white rose bloomed across England, beautiful and bloody and perhaps more fragile than anyone yet realized. Edward IV ruled England with the confidence of youth and victory. But in the shadows of his golden reign, his enemies still breathed, still planned, still dreamed of restoration and revenge. The Wars of the Roses had ended their first act with Yorkist triumph. But in civil wars, intermission was just another word for preparation, and the second act would prove that no victory was ever truly final. Sleep well now. Thank you for listening, one last time. May your sleep be deep, your dreams quiet, and your mind at peace.